Today, I'm in the mood to talk about boss fights. No particular reason, I just feel like it. Boss fights in Crash Bandicoot traditionally suck. They're usually very easy and offer no real threat whatsoever, which is a massive contrast to the complex and challenging levels. Thematically, they're usually pretty cool, but there's no substance in them really, so for no particular reason at all, we're going to dissect some Crash boss fights and talk about why they suck, and how they could be improved to the point where the bosses are, competent. Before we begin, if you find yourself enjoying the video, do leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and also leave a comment with your thoughts on boss fights in Crash Bandicoot. Whether you like them, hate them, whatever, I'm keen to read them. Anyway, let's crack on. So there are a few different types of fights in Crash games. The first type is the wait for an opening and attack fight. This covers a lot of fights across the series, including but not limited to Pinstripe in Crash 1, Ripperoo in Crash 2, the Komodo Brothers in Crash 2, Tiny in Crash 3, Entropy in Crash 3, and Cortex in Crash 3. These are the simplest and generally among the most pathetic fights across the series. All you have to do is avoid the attacks, then simply run up and hit the boss once they're vulnerable. Seriously, as long as you just keep moving and attack when the opportunity presents itself, you'll never have any trouble with these fights. That's why they're so easy. You don't really have to do anything except move out of the way. Ripperoo in Crash 2 is the worst offender for that. If you know the pattern of the TNT and Nitro, you can just move into position and literally wait for Roo to blow himself up. There's no complexity in this type of fight, and that's why they're so bloody pathetic. The second type of fight is where you're able to damage the boss at any point. It's just a matter of avoiding the boss's attacks while you attack. There are a lot less of these fights, some of which include Papu Papu in Crash 1, Engine in Crash 2, Cortex in Crash 2, Engine in Crash 3, Crunch and Rocco in Wrath of Cortex, and Crunch and Lolo in Wrath of Cortex. Some of these can be difficult, some of them can be easy, it really depends on the fight. For example, Papu Papu and Cortex in Crash 2 are absolute jokes that offer no threat whatsoever. Cortex in Crash 2 doesn't even attack you. But Engine in Crash 2 and 3 can be pretty difficult. Well, if you've never seen the fight before, that is. You need to put yourself in danger to deal some damage in these fights, which is different to the first type of fight where you should avoid danger at all costs. But even so, the fights are still very simple, so I wouldn't call them a challenge either. The third type of fight is the type where you cannot attack the boss yourself. You need to turn the boss's attacks against them. You might remember such fights like Koala Kong in Crash 1, Embryo in Crash 1 and Crash 4, Cortex in Crash 1 and Crash 4, Cortex and Mecha Bandicoot in Twinsanity, and Engine in Crash 4. These fights have a little more to them. There's at least one layer of thinking involved in these fights. For example, Koala Kong's fight. It's a very easy fight, but there's more to it than in most other fights in the series. You have to slap Koala Kong's boulders back at him. Actually, that sounds bad. Let me rephrase that. You need to attack Koala Kong with a heavy rock he throws at you, but you also need to look out for the minecarts because if you hit the minecarts, you won't hit Kong. It's an easy fight, but at least there is some level of complexity to it. Still though, I wouldn't exactly call it competent. The last type of fight doesn't turn up often, but it's the type of fight where you can't damage the boss yourself, but you cause damage to the boss indirectly. Ripperoo in Crash 1 and Tiny in Crash 2 are the best known examples of this. In these fights you need to avoid the attacks, if you can call them that, and sort of cause the boss to be damaged by using the environment around you. They're very easy fights though, which is the trend throughout the series, and it's why they usually suck. So the question is, how are you supposed to make a good boss fight? Well, having broken down how the different types of fight work, it's clear that the fights suck because they're extremely simplistic. For the fights to be decent, there needs to be more than just one simple layer of challenge to it. They need to be more complex than just avoiding attacks and waiting for an opening, or just simply reflecting attacks back. Dingadal's fights in Crash 3 and Twinsanity are the fights that have come the closest to having actual layers to them. In both of these fights you can only avoid attacks in the first phase, but in the second phase you need to trick Dingadal into shooting his flamethrower, breaking his shield, or in Twinsanity's case exposing the button to put out his shield. They're probably the only fights with more than one layer to them. To make them better, they need to be more complicated. For example, Cortex's fight in Crash 3. In this fight, Cortex has a shield that is active during the first phase of each round, but is deactivated once Cortex starts throwing bombs. The shield just deactivates randomly with seemingly no reason for it. The fight would have been made so much better if his shield was powered by something like a few generators, so when he starts throwing the bombs you need to trick him into throwing the bombs at the generators, destroying them, and once they're all destroyed, his shield deactivates and then you can attack him. Adding that extra layer makes the fight more complex, longer, and more challenging, and that's just a simple addition. If the boss fights in Crash games were given as much thought as the structure of the levels, they'd be a lot better, because the disparity between the quality of the levels and the quality of the boss fights is enormous. Crash levels are very intricately designed, whereas the boss fights just feel thrown together. Even if the boss fights just had more hazards in them, that would at least make them somewhat more difficult. There just needs to be some extra steps in the process of dealing damage to a boss that would make them more exciting and generally more competent. Anyway, that's kind of all I have to say about the topic. Let me know how you would improve boss fights in the Crash series, since I think we're all in agreement that they're generally pretty bad. Also, leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.